If your gums bleed when you brush, most people ignore it. In fact, many people assume that bleeding gums are simply normal. They aren't. Bleeding is a signal, a small invisible sign that the tissue is inflamed. And most people assume that signal stays in the mouth. A little blood on the brush, a quick rinse, and the thought is gone by breakfast. But what if the body disagrees? What if that small, repeated signal is not just a local event, but something your entire system is quietly responding to? This episode is about one of the most discussed and most misunderstood ideas in modern dentistry: the connection between what happens in your gums and what happens in the rest of your body. And the real question is not whether a connection exists. The question is what that connection actually means. To get this right, we need to be precise about a word that gets used constantly and explained rarely: inflammation. Inflammation is not the enemy. It is one of the most important tools your body has. When you cut your finger, the area turns red, warm, and a little swollen. That is acute inflammation, and it is protective. It arrives, does its job, and leaves. The problem is a different kind. It is called chronic, low-grade inflammation. It does not produce obvious pain or swelling. It runs quietly in the background at a low level for months or even years. Think of it as a small fire that never quite goes out. Not a blaze, just a low, constant smolder that the body keeps tending day after day without ever fully putting it out. And over time, this persistent, low-level activation has been associated with many of the conditions we connect with aging. Here is what makes it so easy to ignore. There is no single moment where you feel it switch on. There is no fever, no swelling you can point to. It is constant and silent. And because you cannot feel it directly, you tend to look for its sources in the obvious places: diet, stress, lack of sleep. The mouth rarely makes that list. Yet the mouth is one of the few places in the body where, for a great many people, an inflammatory process runs continuously and silently for years. So, the question becomes, where does this low-grade inflammation come from? And could the mouth be one of its sources? Periodontitis is the advanced stage of gum disease. It is not simply a little bleeding. Clinically, it means that the tissues supporting the tooth are being progressively damaged: the gum attachment, the periodontal ligament, and the alveolar bone. That is why some researchers describe severe periodontal disease almost like a chronic wound in the mouth, a persistent, inflamed, bacteria-exposed tissue environment that struggles to return to normal healing. The immune system keeps interacting with bacteria in that space day after day without ever fully resolving the situation. Think about the total inflamed surface in an advanced case. If you spread it out, it can cover an area comparable to the palm of your hand. Now picture a low-level immune response across that surface, continuously for years. That is the idea behind what scientists call inflammatory burden, and it is something we can actually measure. One of the markers researchers track is C-reactive protein, or CRP, a protein that rises in the blood when there is inflammation somewhere in the body. Studies have repeatedly observed that as periodontitis becomes more severe, CRP levels tend to rise along with it. And CRP is a marker doctors already use to gauge inflammation and cardiovascular risk throughout the body. So when periodontitis nudges it upward, that signal is showing up on the very same dial physicians watch for entirely different reasons. That is interesting on its own, but association is a weak form of evidence. Plenty of things rise together without one causing the other. So researchers asked a sharper question. Here is where the story gets more compelling. This is the point where researchers stopped asking whether the connection exists and started asking a harder question. If you remove the inflammation in the mouth, does the rest of the body notice? So instead of only observing that periodontitis and inflammation appear together, they tested what happens when you actually treat the gums. A 2023 systematic review published in the Journal of Clinical Periodontology gathered 26 randomized controlled trials involving more than 2,500 participants. It asked a direct question: if you treat periodontitis, does systemic inflammation change? The answer was yes. On average, treating the periodontitis lowered C-reactive protein within about 6 months. For something happening in the mouth, that is a striking reach into the rest of the body. This matters because it moves us from these things appear together to when you change one, the other responds. That is a stronger kind of evidence. It suggests the mouth is not just a bystander, but a genuine, modifiable contributor to the body's inflammatory load. And it brings us straight to the central question of this episode. If treating inflammation in the mouth lowers inflammation elsewhere in the body, what are we actually looking at? For some conditions, the evidence runs deeper than for others. The clearest example is diabetes. Here, the relationship appears to go in both directions. Poorly controlled blood sugar can worsen gum disease, and gum disease may in turn make blood sugar harder to control. A 2022 review published in Periodontology 2000 described this as one of the most studied associations in the entire field, supported by plausible biological mechanisms. It is strong enough that some researchers have informally called periodontitis a possible complication of diabetes. We will give diabetes its own full episode later in this series, so I will not go deep today. But diabetes is not the only place this shows up. Researchers have explored similar connections with pregnancy outcomes and with inflammatory conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis. The common thread is shared inflammatory machinery, the same immune signals appearing in different parts of the body. When the same molecular alarms are firing in the gums, in the joints, and in the lining of the arteries, it is reasonable to suspect they are part of one connected process rather than separate coincidences. Reasonable to suspect, not yet proven that one is driving the next. But I want to be careful here, because a strong, well-studied association is still an association, and this is exactly where most content online stops being honest. So let's do the part that most channels skip. When researchers treat periodontitis and measure the body's response, not everything improves equally. A 2024 meta-analysis published in BMC Oral Health looked at how non-surgical periodontal treatment affected a whole range of cardiovascular risk markers. Some of them did improve. C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, and systolic blood pressure went down, but others did not move in any meaningful way. Cholesterol levels, the function of the lining of the blood vessels, and certain other inflammatory signals showed no clear benefit. In other words, treating the gums lowers some signals of inflammation, but it does not reset the entire cardiovascular system. That pattern, some markers moving and others holding still, is itself a clue. It suggests the mouth contributes to part of the inflammatory signal, but it is not the master switch for everything downstream. That is an important limit. And there is a deeper question still. Does periodontitis actually cause heart disease? Or do the two simply travel together because they share risk factors, like smoking, age, and metabolic health? To test this, scientists use a method called Mendelian randomization, which uses natural genetic differences between people to probe whether one condition truly drives another. The logic is clever. If a gene that makes someone more prone to gum disease also made them more prone to heart disease, that would point toward a real causal thread. If it does not, the link is more likely explained by the company these conditions keep, rather than by one causing the other. A 2024 systematic review published in Molecules and Cells examined exactly this. Its conclusion was sobering. While clinical trials show that treating periodontitis improves inflammatory markers, the studies remain inconclusive about whether it reduces actual cardiovascular events, like heart attacks, and the genetic evidence found no proof of a direct causal link. So the honest summary is this: the association is real. The biological mechanism is plausible. Treatment changes some of the markers, but causation for most of these systemic diseases has not been proven. So let's answer the question we started with. If treating inflammation in the mouth lowers inflammation in the body, what does that mean? And just as importantly, what does it not mean? It does not mean that gum disease causes heart attacks. It does not mean that the dental cleaning is a treatment for diabetes or for cardiovascular disease. Anyone who tells you that is selling a certainty the science does not support. But here is what it does mean. And this part is not small. Your mouth appears to be one measurable, modifiable source of inflammation in your body. Of all the things that contribute to your inflammatory burden, it may be one of the easiest to identify and one of the most straightforward to address. You cannot easily undo years of stress, and you cannot rewrite your genetics. But chronic inflammation in your gums is something that can be detected, measured, and reduced. That is not a miracle cure. It is something better. It is a sensible, low-risk, evidence-informed step inside a much larger picture of health. And think about what that picture includes. Sleep, movement, what you eat, how you manage stress, whether you smoke. Your gums sit inside that same system, shaped by the same habits, and feeding back into the same inflammatory signals. Caring for them is not separate from caring for the rest of you. It may be one of the more concrete, trackable ways to do exactly that. And in a field crowded with exaggerated claims, that measured honesty is the entire point. The connection between your mouth and your body is not magic, and it is not marketing, it is biology. Partly understood, still being investigated, and genuinely worth your attention. That is the conversation worth having, and it is the one we will keep having on this channel. I'm Dr. Mario Para. I'll see you in the next episode. Pay attention, your body already is.